Picture this. You're sitting in your living room on a quiet Tuesday morning when you hear the unmistakable sound of metal crushing against concrete. You rush to your window, and there it is again. Your brand new mailbox, completely destroyed, lying in twisted pieces across your driveway. But this isn't the first time. It's not even the second or third time. This is the sixth time in 8 months that your HOA's so-called enforcement patrol has deliberately run over your perfectly legal mailbox. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to witness the most satisfying HOA revenge story you've ever heard. What started as a simple property dispute turned into a battle of wits that would leave an entire HOA board questioning their life choices, and one homeowner standing victorious with a solution so brilliant, so perfectly legal, and so devastatingly effective that it would become legendary in neighborhood drama circles. You see, most people would have given up after the third destroyed mailbox. They would have moved, filed endless complaints, or simply accepted defeat. But not Mike Henderson. Mike was a retired engineer with time on his hands, a methodical mind, and an absolute refusal to be bullied by power-hungry HOA board members who thought they owned his property. When they destroyed his sixth mailbox, something clicked. He realized that sometimes you do not fight fire with fire, you fight it with engineering precision and a deep understanding of the very rules your enemies think they can use against you. What Mike built in his garage over the next 3 weeks wasn't just a mailbox. It was a masterpiece of calculated revenge that would turn the tables so completely, so spectacularly, that the HOA bullies who had been terrorizing him would never dare to mess with another homeowner again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand just how satisfying this revenge truly was, you need to know how this war began. Mike Henderson had always been the kind of person who believed in playing by the rules. After 37 years as a civil engineer for the State Highway Department, he understood better than most that rules exist for good reasons: safety, fairness, and order. When he and his wife Sarah decided to downsize and move to Sunset Meadows, a planned community in suburban Phoenix, Mike thought he'd found the perfect place to spend his retirement years. Sunset Meadows wasn't just any subdivision. It was one of those meticulously planned communities where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine, where the streets were wide and perfectly maintained, and where the HOA took pride in maintaining property values through strict adherence to community standards. The neighborhood featured 847 homes, each sitting on quarter-acre lots with mature desert landscaping, and amenities that included a golf course, community center, and walking trails that wound through carefully preserved desert terrain. The HOA, officially known as the Sunset Meadows Community Association, was run by a 5-member board elected by the homeowners. On paper, it seemed reasonable enough. The monthly fees were $127, which covered landscape maintenance for common areas, security patrol services, and upkeep of community amenities. The CCNRs, those covenants, conditions, and restrictions that every homeowner agreed to, seemed standard for a community of this type. No commercial vehicles in driveways, no clotheslines visible from the street, no unauthorized modifications to exterior home features. Mike's first hint that something wasn't quite right came during his initial meeting with Janet Prescott, the HOA board president. Janet was a woman in her early 60s who had moved to Sunset Meadows 5 years earlier and had immediately positioned herself as the community's unofficial guardian of standards. She had perfectly styled silver hair, always wore crisp blazers even in Arizona's crushing heat, and had a way of speaking that made every conversation feel like a performance review you were failing. During their introductory meeting, Janet walked Mike around his new property, pointing out various opportunities for improvement. His desert landscaping, which had been professionally installed by the previous owner, needed refreshing. The color of his front door, a warm sage green that complemented the home's earth-tone stucco, was trending toward non-compliance with the community's approved color palette. Most concerning to Janet was Mike's mailbox. a standard black metal post-mounted unit that matched dozens of others throughout the neighborhood. But here's where things get interesting, and where you need to understand the twisted psychology that was about to unfold. Janet didn't just manage the HOA, she had turned it into her personal kingdom. Over her 5-year tenure, she had gradually stacked the board with like-minded individuals who shared her vision of absolute control over every visible aspect of community life. There was Robert Chen, a recently retired bank manager who treated HOA violations like loan defaults. Patricia Williams, a former middle school principal who approached neighborhood disputes with the same authoritarian mindset she'd used to control 13-year-olds. David Martinez, who owned a small landscaping business and saw HOA enforcement as a way to drum up more work for himself. And finally, there was Thomas Burke, the only board member who occasionally showed common sense, but who had been effectively neutered by the other 4. The mailbox issue started innocuously enough. Mike received his first violation notice 3 weeks after moving in. The citation stated that his mailbox post was not in compliance with community standards because it was installed 18 inches from the curb instead of the required 24 inches. Mike measured the distance himself and found that his mailbox was actually 25 inches from the curb, well within compliance. He submitted photographic evidence and measurements to the HOA office, assuming this would resolve the matter. Instead, he received a second violation notice claiming that while the distance might be compliant, the mailbox's height was potentially problematic. The community standards required mailboxes to be between 41 and 45 inches from the ground. Mike's was 43 inches, dead center in the approved range. Again, he documented this with photographs and measurements, submitting a formal response to the board. What Mike didn't realize was that he had made a crucial mistake. By responding to the violations with facts, measurements, and evidence, he had done something that Janet Prescott found absolutely intolerable. He had challenged her authority publicly. In Janet's mind, the specific details of the violations were irrelevant. What mattered was that homeowners understood their place in the community hierarchy, and that place was beneath the HOA board. The third violation notice was where things began to escalate beyond reason. This time, Janet claimed that Mike's mailbox, while technically compliant with written standards, created a visual disruption to community harmony because it was too shiny compared to neighboring mailboxes. The notice demanded that Mike either replace the mailbox with a more weathered-appearing unit or treat the existing mailbox with a dulling agent to reduce its reflectivity. Mike stared at this violation notice for a full 10 minutes, reading it 3 times to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. He walked outside to examine his mailbox, which was a perfectly ordinary black metal unit that he had purchased at Home Depot. It wasn't even particularly new-looking. The previous owner had installed it 2 years earlier. He looked at the neighboring mailboxes and saw units that were newer, shinier, and more reflective than his own. This was Mike's first real glimpse into the arbitrary and vindictive nature of HOA enforcement under Janet Prescott's leadership. But he still believed in the system. He still thought that reasonable people could resolve reasonable disagreements through reasonable processes. He requested a hearing with the HOA board to present his case in person. The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening in the community center's meeting room. Mike arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a folder full of photographs, measurements, and documentation. He had prepared a brief presentation that he believed would definitively prove that his mailbox was in complete compliance with all written community standards. What happened next would be Mike's introduction to the reality of HOA politics, and it would set in motion the chain of events that would eventually lead to one of the most spectacularly satisfying revenge stories in HOA history. But first, you need to understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes, because what Mike discovered that night was that he wasn't dealing with reasonable people enforcing reasonable rules. He was dealing with petty tyrants who had found a legal framework that allowed them to make their neighbors' lives miserable, and they were just getting started. The HOA board hearing was Mike's first real education in how power corrupts even the smallest positions of authority. The community center meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with the 5 board members sitting behind a long table facing a single chair where homeowners were expected to present their cases. Janet Prescott sat in the center, flanked by her 4 allies, each with a manila folder and a stern expression that suggested they had already made their decision. Mike presented his case methodically, just as he had approached engineering problems for nearly 4 decades. He showed photographs proving his mailbox was the correct distance from the curb and the correct height from the ground. He presented documentation showing that his mailbox was identical to dozens of others throughout the community. He even brought a light meter to demonstrate that his mailbox was actually less reflective than several others on his street. Janet listened to his presentation with the kind of polite attention you might give to a small child explaining why they should be allowed to stay up past bedtime. When Mike finished, she smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "Mr. Henderson, we appreciate your thoroughness, but you're missing the bigger picture. This isn't about measurements or technical compliance. This is about community standards, and community standards can't be captured entirely in written rules." Robert Chen jumped in with support. The HOA board has discretionary authority to make determinations about what serves the best interests of the community, even when technical compliance might exist. Patricia Williams added, "As homeowners, we all have a responsibility to contribute to the overall aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood, not just meet minimum requirements." Mike felt like he was taking crazy pills. These people were essentially saying that written rules didn't matter if the board decided they didn't like something for subjective, undefined reasons. He asked for clarification. "So you're saying that even if my mailbox meets every written standard in the CC and Rs, you can still find it in violation based on your personal aesthetic preferences?" Janet's smile got colder. "Mr. Henderson, I think you're misunderstanding the collaborative spirit that makes communities like Sunset Meadows so special. We're not trying to punish anyone. We're trying to work together to maintain the property values and quality of life that brought us all here in the first place." The board voted 4-1 to uphold the violation, with Thomas Burke casting the lone dissenting vote. Mike was given 30 days to replace or modify his mailbox to the board's satisfaction, with daily fines of $25 beginning after the deadline. Mike left that meeting with a sick feeling in his stomach, but he wasn't ready to give up. If the board wanted a different mailbox, he would get a different mailbox. He spent the next weekend visiting hardware stores and home improvement centers, looking for a mailbox that might satisfy their vague aesthetic requirements. He finally settled on a slightly smaller unit in a dark bronze finish that looked appropriately weathered from the factory. The installation went smoothly, and Mike was confident that this would resolve the issue. His new mailbox was clearly compliant with all written standards and had the subdued appearance that the board seemed to prefer. He submitted photographs to the HOA office and waited for confirmation that the violation had been resolved. Instead, 2 weeks later, he found his new mailbox lying in pieces across his driveway. Mike's first instinct was to assume this was vandalism by teenagers or random troublemakers. He filed a police report and installed a small security camera pointed toward the mailbox area. He replaced the destroyed mailbox with an identical unit and waited to see if the vandalism would continue. He didn't have to wait long. 4 days later, at 2:17 a.m., according to his security camera, a white SUV drove slowly down his street, veered onto his property, and deliberately ran over his mailbox before speeding away. The license plate was clearly visible in the infrared footage. It belonged to David Martinez, the HOA board member who owned the landscaping business. Mike was furious, but he was also smart. He made copies of the footage and filed another police report, this time with clear evidence of the perpetrator. He also submitted the evidence to the HOA board, demanding that Martinez be removed from his position and that the HOA reimburse him for the destroyed mailboxes. The response he received was a masterpiece of gaslighting and bureaucratic doublespeak. Janet Prescott acknowledged receipt of his allegations, but noted that internal HOA matters must be handled through proper channels. She suggested that Mike might have misunderstood Martinez's intentions. Perhaps he had been checking for compliance issues and had accidentally damaged the mailbox in the process. The board would look into the matter, but in the meantime, Mike was still responsible for maintaining a compliant mailbox on his property. This was the moment when Mike realized he wasn't dealing with misguided community volunteers. He was dealing with criminals who were using the HOA as cover for deliberate harassment and property destruction. But here's what the board didn't know about Mike Henderson. 37 years of government work had taught him exactly how bureaucracies operate, and 43 years of marriage had taught him the value of patience and long-term planning. Mike installed a new mailbox and upgraded his security system to include multiple cameras with cloud storage backup. He began documenting every interaction with the HOA, creating a detailed file that included dates, times, witnesses, and photographic evidence. He researched Arizona HOA law and discovered that board members could be held personally liable for violations of their fiduciary duties. Most importantly, he began studying the community as CC and Rs with the same methodical attention he had once applied to highway engineering specifications. The pattern of harassment continued with clockwork regularity. Every 2 to 3 weeks, usually in the early morning hours, someone would destroy Mike's mailbox. Sometimes it was Martinez in his landscaping truck. Sometimes it was Robert Chen in his sedan. Once, memorably, it was Janet Prescott herself in her pristine white Lexus SUV, caught on camera backing up 3 times to make sure she had completely flattened the mailbox post. Each time, Mike would file a police report, document the damage, and replace the mailbox. Each time, the HOA board would find new excuses to justify their actions or deflect responsibility. The mailbox was installed in the wrong location. The design wasn't approved. The color was non-compliant. The post was too thick, too thin, too tall, too short, too shiny, too dull. By the 6th destroyed mailbox, Mike had spent over $800 of his own money and countless hours dealing with police reports, insurance claims, and HOA paperwork. His neighbors were starting to whisper about the troublemaker who kept having problems with his mailbox. Some openly wondered why he didn't just move to a different neighborhood where he could follow the rules. But Mike had reached a different conclusion entirely. He had realized that this wasn't really about mailboxes at all. This was about power and control, about a small group of people who had discovered they could make their neighbors miserable with impunity. Janet Prescott and her allies weren't trying to maintain community standards. They were running a protection racket, using HOA rules as weapons to punish anyone who dared to question their authority. Most people would have given up by this point. They would have moved away, accepted defeat, or tried to appease the board with increasingly desperate compromises. But Mike Henderson wasn't most people. He was an engineer who had spent decades solving complex problems, and he had just identified the parameters of the most challenging and personally satisfying problem of his retirement. The HOA board thought they were untouchable because they controlled the rules and had legal cover for their harassment. They thought Mike was just another homeowner who would eventually be worn down by their persistence and vindictiveness. What they didn't realize was that they had picked the wrong target, and that their 6th act of mailbox destruction was about to trigger a response that would expose them as the petty criminals they really were. Mike's solution wouldn't just protect his mailbox. It would turn their own weapons against them in a way so elegant, so perfectly legal, and so devastatingly effective that it would become the stuff of legend. But to understand why his revenge was so satisfying, you need to appreciate just how completely the board thought they had won, and how confident they were that Mike Henderson was beaten. After the 6th destroyed mailbox, Mike Henderson disappeared into his garage for 3 weeks. His neighbors probably thought he had finally given up, that Janet Prescott and her board of bullies had successfully driven another troublemaker into submission. They had no idea that Mike was working 18-hour days on what would become the most brilliant piece of HOA revenge engineering in recorded history. You see, Mike's advantage wasn't just his engineering background, it was his intimate knowledge of government bureaucracy and legal loopholes. He had spent nearly 4 decades navigating the maze of federal, state, and local regulations that govern everything from highway construction to environmental compliance. He understood that every rule creates counter-rules, every regulation opens up exceptions, and every bureaucratic system contains the seeds of its own destruction if you know where to look. Mike started with a complete audit of the Sunset Meadows CC and Rs, but this time he wasn't looking for compliance requirements. He was looking for enforcement mechanisms, legal precedents, and most importantly, the specific language that gave the HOA board their authority over mailbox installations. What he found was a treasure trove of legal ammunition that the board had been too arrogant and short-sighted to consider. The first breakthrough came when Mike discovered that the CC and Rs included a clause requiring all architectural modifications to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, a separate body from the HOA board. Mailbox installations, according to the legal definition used in the community documents, qualified as architectural modifications. This meant that the HOA board had been operating outside their legal authority for months, issuing violations and demanding changes to installations that were actually under the jurisdiction of a different committee. But that was just the beginning. Mike's real masterstroke came when he found a clause buried in Section 14.3 of the CC and Rs that addressed emergency safety modifications. This clause allowed homeowners to make immediate changes to their property without prior approval if those changes were necessary to address documented safety hazards or security concerns. Mike had documented security concerns in spades. He had police reports documenting 6 separate acts of vandalism against his mailbox. He had video evidence of HOA board members deliberately destroying his property. He had photographs showing debris from destroyed mailboxes scattered across the street, creating potential hazards for vehicles and pedestrians. Under the Emergency Safety Modification Clause, he was not only allowed to take protective measures, he was arguably required to do so. Mike's solution was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. He was going to build a mailbox that was absolutely, unquestionably compliant with every written standard in the CC and Rs while being completely immune to the kind of vehicular harassment that had destroyed 6 previous units. But his masterstroke wasn't just about protection. It was about turning the board's own enforcement mechanisms against them. The new mailbox post was a work of engineering art. Mike started with a standard 4x4 pressure-treated wooden post, exactly as specified in the community guidelines. But buried 3 feet underground, invisible to casual inspection, was a concrete foundation that extended 18 inches in every direction. The wooden post was actually just a decorative sleeve around a steel I-beam that was anchored into this foundation with enough tensile strength to stop a pickup truck. The mailbox itself was positioned at exactly 43 inches from the ground and exactly 24 inches from the curb, dead center in the approved ranges. Mike had even researched the specific shade of black paint recommended in the original community architectural guidelines and matched it precisely. By every written measure in the CC and Rs, his installation was not just compliant, it was perfect. But Mike's real genius was in the documentation. He had filed the installation under the Emergency Safety Modification Clause, including a detailed engineering report that demonstrated how his design addressed the ongoing security concerns documented in 6 police reports. He had submitted architectural drawings, materials specifications, and even soil composition analysis to justify the foundation requirements. Every single element was supported by either community guidelines or legitimate engineering principles. The installation took Mike and 2 of his retired engineer friends an entire weekend, working mostly at night to avoid attention. When they finished, the new mailbox looked almost identical to the previous units. maybe slightly more robust, but nothing that would draw immediate notice. The real difference was completely invisible until someone tried to destroy it. Mike didn't have to wait long to test his engineering. 5 days after the installation, at 1:43 a.m., David Martinez's landscaping truck came rumbling down the street for what he undoubtedly expected to be his 7th easy act of mailbox destruction. The truck veered onto Mike's property, accelerated toward the mailbox, and struck the post at approximately 15 miles per hour. The result was spectacular. Instead of the satisfying crunch of splintering wood and crumpling metal that Martinez had come to expect, there was a tremendous crash as the truck's front bumper crumpled against what was essentially an immovable object. The mailbox post didn't even shake. Martinez's truck, on the other hand, suffered a destroyed bumper, a cracked radiator, 2 blown tires, and enough frame damage to make it undrivable. Mike's security cameras captured every glorious second of Martinez's panicked attempts to back away from the mailbox, the steam pouring from his destroyed radiator, and his eventual call for a tow truck. But Mike's cameras also captured something even more valuable: clear evidence that Martinez had deliberately targeted the mailbox with his vehicle, providing irrefutable proof of intentional property destruction and attempted vandalism. The next morning, Mike submitted his footage to both the police and the HOA board, along with a formal complaint demanding Martinez's immediate removal from the board and full reimbursement for all previous mailbox destruction. But he also did something that caught the board completely off guard. He filed a formal safety violation against Martinez for creating a hazardous debris field on community property. Under the same CC and R provisions that the board had been using to harass him, Mike demonstrated that Martinez's destroyed truck parts and leaked fluids constituted a violation of community standards regarding unsightly debris and environmental hazards. He demanded immediate cleanup and imposed the same $25 daily fines that the board had been threatening him with for months. Janet Prescott's response was predictable. She dismissed Mike's complaint and accused him of installing an unauthorized and potentially dangerous structure that posed risks to community safety. She demanded immediate removal of the non-compliant mailbox and threatened legal action if Mike didn't comply within 48 hours. This was exactly what Mike had been hoping for. Janet had just made the fatal mistake of putting her ignorance and overreach in writing. Mike's response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare that would have made Sun Tzu proud. First, he submitted a detailed rebuttal demonstrating that his mailbox installation was not only compliant with all community standards, but had been properly filed under the Emergency Safety Modification Clause. He included references to specific CC and R sections, architectural guidelines, and legal precedents that supported every aspect of his installation. Then he went nuclear. Mike filed formal ethics complaints against Martinez for destruction of property, against Janet for abuse of authority, and against the entire board for operating outside their legal jurisdiction. But his real masterstroke was filing a safety violation against Janet herself for demanding the removal of a safety enhancement that had been installed to address documented security threats. Under the board's own enforcement standards, demanding the removal of safety equipment constituted a violation of community welfare provisions. Mike imposed daily fines against Janet personally, using the exact same language and fee structure that she had been using against him. He even copied her bureaucratic tone perfectly. "Miss Prescott, the board appreciates your concerns, but the mailbox installation serves the best interests of community safety and cannot be removed without proper justification through established review processes." The beauty of Mike's strategy was that he was using the board's own weapons against them, applying their own arbitrary and vindictive enforcement standards to their own actions. Every precedent they had set while harassing him now applied to their behavior. Every procedural shortcut they had taken now worked in his favor. Every abuse of authority they had committed was now documented evidence supporting his case. Janet Prescott had spent months believing she was untouchable, that her position as board president gave her unlimited power to make homeowners' lives miserable. She was about to discover that power without accountability is just bullying, and bullies eventually meet someone who refuses to be intimidated. The war between Mike Henderson and the Sunset Meadows HOA board was about to enter its final phase, and it would end with a reversal of fortune so complete, so humiliating for the bullies, and so satisfying for everyone who had ever been victimized by petty tyrants that it would become legendary in HOA revenge circles. But the best was yet to come. The aftermath of Martinez's truck meeting Mike's engineered mailbox created ripple effects throughout Sunset Meadows that nobody could have anticipated. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about the landscaping truck that had been destroyed trying to run over a mailbox, and suddenly residents who had been quietly enduring their own HOA harassment began paying attention to Mike Henderson's very public battle with the board. Mike's documentation strategy paid dividends beyond his wildest expectations. Every police report, every violation notice, every piece of video evidence, and every bureaucratic exchange he had carefully preserved became ammunition in a legal war that would expose the board's systematic abuse of authority. But more importantly, his meticulous record-keeping revealed a pattern of harassment that extended far beyond his own experience. As news of Mike's indestructible mailbox spread through the community, other residents began coming forward with their own stories of board harassment. Mrs. Chen, no relation to board member Robert Chen, had been fighting a 2-year battle over the color of her front door, receiving weekly violation notices for a paint shade that was clearly within the approved palette. The Johnsons had been fined repeatedly for excessive Christmas decorations that consisted of a single wreath and some tasteful outdoor lighting. The Rodriguez family had been threatened with legal action for planting roses that the board claimed were too tall, despite being well within height restrictions. Mike realized that Janet Prescott and her allies had not just been targeting him, they had been systematically bullying residents throughout the community, using selective enforcement and arbitrary interpretations to maintain their power through intimidation. His mailbox battle had accidentally exposed a much larger pattern of abuse that had been flying under the radar for years. The turning point came when Mike organized what he called a compliance documentation party. Residents who had been dealing with HOA harassment were invited to bring their violation notices, correspondence, and evidence to Mike's garage, where he helped them organize their cases using the same systematic approach he had applied to his mailbox situation. What they discovered was a treasure trove of procedural violations, illegal fines, and abuse of authority that painted a damning picture of board corruption. Janet Prescott made her final fatal mistake when she decided to escalate the conflict by filing a lawsuit against Mike for installation of unauthorized structures and willful violation of community standards. She was confident that the cost and complexity of legal proceedings would force Mike to back down and remove his mailbox. Instead, she had just given Mike access to the discovery process, which would allow him to subpoena all HOA records and force the board to defend their actions under oath. Mike's attorney, a sharp young lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and who took the case partly because he was fascinated by the engineering aspects of Mike's revenge, immediately filed countersuits for harassment, property destruction, and violation of fiduciary duty. But the real bombshell came when they requested all HOA financial records, enforcement files, and board meeting minutes for the past 3 years. What they found was devastating. The board had been operating what was essentially a protection racket, targeting residents for harassment while steering remediation work to businesses owned by board members or their friends. David Martinez's landscaping company had received over $40,000 in HOA contracts over the past 2 years, all awarded without competitive bidding. Robert Chen had been approving loans to homeowners from his bank to pay HOA fines, creating a conflict of interest that was both unethical and illegal. Patricia Williams had been using her position to settle personal disputes with neighbors by filing trumped-up violations. But the most shocking discovery was Janet Prescott's use of HOA funds for personal expenses. She had been billing the association for community oversight activities that included expensive dinners, weekend trips, and even home improvement projects at her own property. Over 3 years, she had embezzled nearly $15,000 from the community association while terrorizing residents with arbitrary enforcement actions. The legal proceedings moved quickly once the scope of the board's corruption became clear. Martinez was arrested for property destruction and insurance fraud. Chen faced bank regulatory action for his conflicts of interest. Williams was sued by 3 different residents for harassment and abuse of authority. But Janet Prescott faced the most serious consequences: criminal charges for embezzlement, civil lawsuits from dozens of harassed residents, and removal from the board under a cloud of scandal that would follow her for years. Mike's mailbox, meanwhile, had become something of a neighborhood landmark. Residents would walk by to admire the tank mailbox that had brought down a corrupt HOA board. Kids would dare each other to knock on it, amazed by the solid thunk that proved it was completely immovable. Real estate agents began using Mike's story as a selling point, highlighting how the community had successfully removed corrupt leadership and reformed its governance structure. The new HOA board, elected in emergency proceedings after the mass resignation of Prescott's allies, implemented sweeping reforms that transformed community governance. They established clear appeal processes, transparent enforcement standards, and regular audits of board activities. Thomas Burke, the one board member who had consistently opposed Prescott's harassment tactics, became the new president and worked with Mike to develop enforcement guidelines that emphasized fairness and consistency over arbitrary authority. Mike's legal victory was comprehensive and satisfying. The HOA was required to reimburse him for all destroyed mailboxes, legal fees. The mailbox itself never suffered another attack. Word had spread throughout the community about what happened to vehicles that tried to destroy Mike's installation, and even teenagers looking for vandalism targets gave it a wide berth. Mike occasionally received visits from engineers and DIY enthusiasts who wanted to examine his design, and he was always happy to explain the principles behind his unstoppable post, while emphasizing the importance of proper permits and safety considerations. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the transformation of Sunset Meadows from a community ruled by fear and arbitrary authority into a place where residents felt empowered to challenge unfair treatment. Mike's victory had shown that even the most entrenched bullies could be defeated if you understood the rules better than they did and had the patience to document their abuses systematically. Janet Prescott eventually moved away from Sunset Meadows, unable to face the daily reminders of her humiliating downfall. Her replacement mailbox, installed after her own was mysteriously destroyed by unknown vandals shortly after her arrest, was a modest, standard unit that attracted no attention whatsoever. David Martinez's landscaping business collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and criminal charges, and he was last seen working for a competitor who had benefited greatly from the community's newfound commitment to competitive bidding. Mike Henderson, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. His story was featured in engineering magazines, homeowner rights publications, and even a documentary about HOA abuse. He received hundreds of letters from residents dealing with similar harassment, and he worked with legal organizations to develop resources for homeowners facing corrupt boards. The garage where Mike had engineered his revenge became a workshop where he helped neighbors with their own projects, always emphasizing the importance of following proper procedures and documenting everything thoroughly. His walls were covered with thank you letters from residents who had successfully challenged unfair HOA actions using techniques they learned from his experience. Mike's story raises important questions about power, accountability, and the delicate balance between community standards and individual rights. How many Janet Prescotts are out there, hiding behind the legitimate authority of HOA boards while pursuing personal vendettas against their neighbors? How many residents suffer in silence rather than challenge corrupt officials who seem untouchable? But perhaps most importantly, Mike's victory demonstrates that bullies, no matter how much authority they think they have, are ultimately vulnerable to the same thing that has always defeated them. Someone who refuses to be intimidated, who understands the system better than they do, and who has the patience to turn their own weapons against them. The next time you drive past a mailbox in your neighborhood, remember Mike Henderson's story. That innocent-looking post might just be an iceberg, mostly hidden, perfectly legal, and absolutely immovable. And somewhere in America, there's probably another corrupt HOA board that's about to discover that they've picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting engineering.